Hello Van Dyke, and welcome to Chapter 2 of The Bad Beginning by Lemony Snicket. Thank you to Miss Page for starting us off yesterday with Chapter 1. Just to remind you all, we met the three Baudelaire children, Violet, Klaus and Sunny, and unfortunately, within the chapter, playing on the beach, a strange figure approaches them. They realise it's Mr. Poe, who informs them that their parents have been killed in a house fire, and by the end of the chapter they realise they are now orphans, destitute in the world itself. So, let's begin. It is useless for me to describe to you how terrible Violet, Klaus and even Sunny felt in the time that followed. If you've ever lost someone that is very important to you, then you already know how it feels. And if you haven't, you can't possibly imagine it. For the Baudelaire children, it is of course especially terrible because they'd lost both their same parents at the same time. And for several days they felt so miserable they could scarcely get out of bed. Klaus found he had little interest in books. Violet's well-inventive brain seemed to stop. And even Sunny, poor little Sunny, who was of course too young to really understand what was going, did things with less enthusiasm. Of course, it didn't make things easier that they'd lost their home as well. And all their possessions. As I'm sure you know, one's own bed, one's own room, can often make a bleak situation a lot seem a little better. But the beds of the Baudelaire orphans had been reduced to charred rubble. Mr. Poe had taken them to the remains of the Baudelaire mansion to see if anything had been unharmed. And it was terrible. Violet's microscope had fused together in the heat of the fire. Klaus's favourite pen was just ash, and all of Sunny's teething rings, yes, all of them, had melted. Here and there the children could see traces of the enormous home that they had loved. Fragments of their grand piano, an elegant bottle in which Mr. Baudelaire kept brandy, and the scorched cushion of the window seat where their mother liked to sit and read. Their home destroyed, the Baudelaires had to recuperate from their terrible loss in the Poe household, which was not all that agreeable. Mr. Poe was scarcely at home. He was far too busy dealing with the Baudelaire affairs. And Mrs. Poe, well, she purchased clothing for the orphans, which was of the most grotesque colours, and also itched. And then there was the two children, Edgar and Albert. They were loud and obnoxious, and they had to share a tiny room that smelled of some sort of ghastly flower. But even given the surroundings, the children had mixed feelings when over a dull dinner of boiled chicken, boiled potatoes, and blanched, and when I say blanched, I mean boiled, string beans, Mr. Poe announced that they were to leave his household the next morning. "Good," said Albert, who had a piece of potato stuck between his teeth. "Now we can get our room back. I'm tired of sharing it. Violet and Klaus are always just moping around and they're never any fun." "And the baby bites," Edgar said, tossing a chicken bone to the floor as if he was an animal in the zoo and not the son of a well-respected member of the banking community. "Mr. Poe, where will we go?" Violet asked nervously. Mr. Poe opened his mouth to say something but erupted into a brief fit of coughing. "I have made arrangements," he said finally, "for you to be raised by a distant relative of yours who lives on the other side of town. His name is Count Olaf." Violet, Klaus and Sunny looked at one another, unsure of what to think. On one hand, they didn't want to live with the Poes any longer, but on the other hand, they'd never heard of this Count and didn't know what he'd be like. "Your parents will," Mr. Poe said, "instructs that you shall be raised in the most convenient way possible. Here in the city, you'll be used to your surroundings. This Count Olaf is the only relative who lives within the urban limits." Klaus thought this over for a minute as he swallowed a chewy bit of bean. "But our parents never mentioned Count Olaf to us. Just how is he related to us exactly?" Mr. Poe sighed and looked down at Sunny, who was biting a fork and listening closely. "He's either a third cousin 4 times removed or a 4th cousin 3 times removed. He's not your closest relative on the family tree, but he is closest geographically. That's why." "If he lives in the city," Violet said, "why didn't our parents ever invite him over?" "Possibly because he's very busy," Mr. Poe said. "He's an actor by trade and often travels around the world with various theatre companies." "I thought he was a count," Klaus asked. "He is both a count and an actor," Mr. Poe said. "Now, I don't mean to cut short dinner, but our children have to pack up your things, and I have to return to the bank to do some more work. Like your new legal guardian, I am very busy myself." The three Baudelaire children had many more questions for Mr. Poe, but he had already stood up from the table and, with a slight wave of his hand, departed from the room. They heard him coughing into his handkerchief, and then the front door creaked shut as he left the house. "Well," Mrs. Poe said, "you three had better start packing. Edgar, Albert, please help me clear the table." The Baudelaire orphans went to the bedroom and glumly packed their few belongings. Klaus looked distastefully at each ugly shirt Mrs. Poe had bought for him as he folded them and put them into a small suitcase. Violet looked around the cramped, smelly room in which they had been living, and Sunny crawled around solemnly, biting each of Edgar and Albert's shoes, leaving small teeth marks in each one so she would not be forgotten. From time to time, the Baudelaire children looked at one another, but with their future such a mystery, they could think of nothing to say. At bedtime they tossed and turned all night, scarcely getting any sleep between the loud snoring of Edgar and Albert and their own worried thoughts. Finally, Mr. Poe knocked on the door and stuck his head into the bedroom. "Rise and shine, Baudelaires," he said. "It's time for you to go to Count Olaf's." Violet looked around the crowded bedroom, and even though she didn't like it, she felt very nervous about leaving. "Do we have to go right this minute?"